USS William D. Porter. On November 12, 1943, the Fletcher-class destroyer USS William D. Porter departed Norfolk, Virginia, as part of an escort detail for the battleship USS Iowa, which was transporting President Franklin Roosevelt to the Tehran Conference for a meeting with Churchill and Stalin. The crew of the Porter had been told nothing about the identity of their charge, only that the mission was classified and radio silence was mandatory. Within the first hour of leaving port, the Porter's anchor caught on a neighboring destroyer and ripped out sections of its railing and a lifeboat. The following day, the Porter accidentally triggered a depth charge with no warning, prompting every other escort ship to begin evasive maneuvers, believing a submarine attack had begun. Then, during a torpedo drill, a live torpedo was accidentally fired directly at the Iowa, carrying the President of the United States. The torpedo missed, only because the Iowa was alerted in time and took evasive action. The Porter's captain was immediately arrested. The entire crew was placed under arrest upon arrival in Bermuda, the only time in United States Navy history that an entire ship's crew was collectively detained. Several crew members were court-martialed, and one, the sailor whose error launched the live torpedo, was sentenced to 14 years hard labor, a sentence later commuted by Roosevelt himself, who apparently found the episode more amusing than alarming. The Porter went on to serve in the Pacific, accidentally shooting down 3 American aircraft before being sunk by a Japanese kamikaze in June 1945. In a final twist consistent with her entire career, the kamikaze missed, hit the water beside the ship, and the underwater explosion from the sinking plane was enough to tear open the hull and sink the Porter. The entire crew survived. HMS Sheffield. On May 4th, 1982, the British Type 42 guided missile destroyer HMS Sheffield was on picket duty approximately 56 kilometers south of the Falkland Islands, operating as part of the British Naval Task Force, sent to retake the islands from Argentina. Its role was to provide early warning of approaching aircraft, a mission that made it the outermost vessel in the fleet, and therefore the most exposed. At approximately 11:00 in the morning, 2 Argentine Super Etendard aircraft approached at low altitude below the Sheffield's radar horizon and launched 2 AIM-39 Exocet anti-ship missiles. The Sheffield detected the missiles only seconds before impact. One missile malfunctioned and missed. The second struck the destroyer amidships, penetrating its hull and igniting a fire that consumed the ship's interior. The rocket motor of the Exocet itself is believed to have continued burning inside the ship after impact, a detail that distinguished the damage from a conventional explosion. Sheffield's crew abandoned ship 3 hours after the strike. 20 men were killed and 26 more were wounded. Sheffield became the first British warship sunk in enemy action since World War II, a fact that shocked a public that had assumed modern defenses made such losses unlikely. Post-incident analysis identified several contributing failures. The Sheffield search radar had been switched off at the time of the attack to allow satellite communications, which shared the same electronic frequency band, creating a brief window in which incoming threats were invisible to the ship's own systems. The loss of Sheffield fundamentally changed British naval doctrine regarding electronic warfare and sensor management, and demonstrated to the world that Exocet missiles, which Argentina had purchased commercially in the open market, posed a genuine threat to sophisticated modern warships operating without continuous 360-degree electronic surveillance. USS Stark. On May 17, 1987, the Oliver Hazard Perry-class frigate USS Stark was on patrol in the Persian Gulf during the tanker war phase of the Iran-Iraq conflict, a period in which the United States Navy had deployed vessels to protect international shipping in the region. Stark was not at war with Iraq. The two countries were not in a state of hostility. What happened next was a consequence of a misidentification and a failure to respond that cost 37 American sailors their lives. An Iraqi Air Force Mirage F-1 aircraft identified Stark as a target and fired 2 AIM-39 Exo-CT missiles at the ship without challenge. The first missile struck below the bridge on the port side, wounding several crew members and starting a fire. The second struck almost immediately afterward, penetrating the ship's hull in the same area and detonating its warhead inside. The resulting explosion and fire killed 37 sailors, most of them trapped in berthing compartments near the point of impact. Stark survived ultimately returning to service, but the damage required extensive repairs lasting months. The investigation found that Stark's crew had received multiple warnings about the approaching Iraqi aircraft, but had not raised the ship's threat level or activated its close-in weapon system. The crew's response time to the incoming missiles was effectively zero because no action had been taken in the preceding minutes that would have put the ship's defenses on alert. The Iraqi government described the attack as accidental, expressing condolences, and paying $27.3 million electorate in compensation to the families of the dead. No Iraqi official was ever charged with any offense. The Stark incident directly led to new rules of engagement for U.S. Navy vessels in the Persian Gulf and prompted a review of how quickly destroyer crews needed to escalate defensive readiness when in proximity to aircraft of any nationality. HMS Coventry. On May 25, 1982, 3 weeks after the loss of HMS Sheffield, the Type 42 destroyer HMS Coventry was operating north of the Falkland Islands in coordination with the frigate HMS Broadsword, attempting to draw Argentine air attacks away from the main landing force at San Carlos Water. The two ships were acting as a deliberate decoy, a role that made the risk of attack not just possible, but expected. In the early afternoon, 4 Argentine A-4 Skyhawks broke through this defensive perimeter and attacked. Broadsword's Sea Wolf missile system, which should have engaged the incoming aircraft, malfunctioned at the critical moment. 3 1,000-pound bombs struck Coventry in rapid succession. The ship began to capsize within minutes, rolling to port and sinking in approximately 20 minutes from the first hit. 19 sailors were killed, and 30 more were wounded. The speed of the sinking was such that many crew members had to jump directly into the South Atlantic Ocean, where water temperatures were low enough to produce hypothermia within a short time. Helicopters from Broadsword conducted the rescue operation, pulling survivors from the water for hours. The loss of Coventry coming on the same afternoon as the sinking of the container ship Atlantic Conveyor by Exocet represented the most costly single day of the Falklands conflict for the British task force. Coventry had effectively succeeded in her mission as a decoy, drawing the attacks that may otherwise have fallen on the landing ships at San Carlos, a fact that provided little comfort to the families of the 19 men who died performing it. USS Cole. On October 12, 2000, the guided missile destroyer USS Cole was making a routine refueling stop in Aden Harbor, Yemen, when a small harbor craft approached the ship's port side, appearing to conduct a routine line handling task. 2 men aboard the small boat stood at attention as it drew alongside, a gesture so ordinary that crew members who observed it assumed it was some kind of local courtesy. The boat contained an estimated 300 to 700 pounds of high explosive. The blast tore a 12 by 12 meter hole in the Cole's hull at the waterline, killing 17 sailors instantly and injuring 37 more. The ship's crew, following established force protection protocols, had allowed the boat to approach because it appeared to be an official harbor service vessel. Al-Qaeda later claimed responsibility for the attack. The investigation found that intelligence agencies had warning information about Al-Qaeda's intent to attack American naval vessels in the region that had not been fully shared with the ships operating there. The rules of engagement governing how crews could respond to approaching small craft in harbor environments were found to be ambiguous about the point at which defensive action was authorized. Cole survived the blast and was eventually repaired and returned to service at a cost of approximately $250 million. The Cole bombing was at the time the deadliest attack against a United States naval vessel since the USS Stark incident 13 years earlier. It is now recognized as one of the key intelligence failures preceding the September 11th attacks, an event that occurred less than a year later and was organized by the same organization. USS Fitzgerald. On June 17, 2017, the Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyer USS Fitzgerald was operating 56 nautical miles southwest of Yokosuka, Japan, at approximately 1:30 in the morning when it collided with the ACX Crystal, a 29,000-ton Philippine-registered container ship. The Crystal's bulbous bow punched a massive hole in Fitzgerald's starboard side below the waterline. Hundreds of tons of water flooded into the berth compartments where sailors were sleeping off watch. 7 men drowned in their sleeping quarters before watertight integrity could be restored. 3 more were injured, including the commanding officer. The Fitzgerald's crew kept the ship from sinking through emergency damage control efforts that lasted throughout the night. The NTSB investigation found a catalog of failures. The watch team had been awake far too long, the ship's radar had not been monitored continuously, navigation charts had not been updated to reflect the heavily trafficked shipping lanes. The ship was transiting, and multiple safety protocols had been systematically deferred across the 7th Fleet due to operational pace that exceeded the capacity of crews to maintain training and readiness simultaneously. The Navy's internal investigation obtained by Navy Times and kept secret from the public found the failures extended well above the ship's individual crew to the command structure overseeing the entire 7th Fleet. Both the commanding officer and executive officer were relieved of their positions. Criminal charges of negligent homicide were eventually brought and subsequently dismissed. 7 sailors were dead because their destroyer had turned into the path of a cargo ship, broadcasting its position on an internationally required navigation system that no one on the Fitzgerald's bridge was monitoring. USS John S. McCain on August 21, 2017. Exactly 65 days after the Fitzgerald disaster, the Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyer USS John S. McCain collided with the Alnick MC, a 30,000-ton Liberian-flagged chemical tanker in the Strait of Malacca near Singapore while transiting at approximately 20 knots. 10 sailors were killed, their bodies found in flooded compartments. 5 others were injured. The McCain's crew had been attempting to transfer helm control between stations during the transit, a procedure that resulted in a momentary loss of steering authority, during which the ship turned directly into the path of the oncoming tanker. The investigation found that the crew had not been adequately trained on the ship's integrated steering control system, and that the 7th Fleet's sustained high operational tempo had produced endemic fatigue and training deficiencies across multiple ships simultaneously. The 2 collisions in the same fleet within the same 10-week period prompted the Chief of Naval Operations to order a worldwide operational pause across the entire United States Navy surface fleet, the first time such a pause had been ordered in recent history. A comprehensive investigation of the 7th Fleet concluded that systemic failures in training maintenance and command culture had allowed standards to deteriorate over years to the point that sailors were operating complex warships without the basic competency the missions required. The commanding officer of USS McCain was charged with negligent homicide and dereliction of duty. The charges were eventually dismissed. The 2 collisions of 2017 killed 17 American sailors, destroyed more than $100 million in naval assets, and ended the careers of multiple officers in incidents that neither required a hostile actor nor a mechanical failure to produce their outcomes. HMS Antelope. On May 23, 1982, the British Type 21 frigate HMS Antelope was anchored in San Carlos water in the Falkland Islands, having survived 2 Argentine air attacks earlier in the day that had resulted in 2 unexploded bombs lodging in the ship's hull. A bomb disposal team was attempting to defuse one of the unexploded devices that evening when it detonated, killing Staff Sergeant James Prescott of the Royal Engineers, who was working on it, and injuring his partner, Corporal Phil Fellows. The explosion set off a fire that the crew fought through the night, but by morning, the fires had reached the ship's ammunition magazine. At approximately 10:30 the following morning, Antelope's magazine exploded in a blast that broke the ship's back and sent a column of fire and debris hundreds of feet into the air. The wreck burned for 2 days before sinking. 1 sailor, in addition to Prescott, had been killed in the initial Argentine attacks. The photographic image of Antelope's magazine exploding, captured by a military photographer and published worldwide, became one of the most iconic images of the Falklands War. The loss illustrated a specific hazard of the Falklands conflict. Argentine bombs dropped from low altitude, which was necessary to avoid British missiles, frequently did not have sufficient altitude to arm before striking, producing a wave of unexploded ordnance that posed an equal or greater risk to British ships in the days following the initial attacks. Several British ships were damaged or sunk by bombs that had first been declared unexploded and then either detonated during disposal or armed themselves through subsequent movement or heat. HMAS Voyager collision. On February 10, 1964. The Royal Australian Navy destroyer HMAS Voyager was cut in half by the aircraft carrier HMAS Melbourne during exercises in the Tasman Sea off the New South Wales coast. Melbourne had turned to conduct a flight operations course and failed to account for the position of Voyager, which had maneuvered to take up a new station. The carrier's bow struck Voyager amidships and effectively severed the destroyer in two, the forward section sinking rapidly and the stern section remaining afloat for several hours before sinking as well. 82 Australian sailors were killed in what remains the worst peacetime naval disaster in Australian history. The subsequent Royal Commission produced a report whose conclusions were disputed from the moment of their publication, with competing assessments of whether the collision was primarily the fault of Melbourne's command team or Voyager's. A second Royal Commission was convened years later after additional evidence emerged. The political controversy over responsibility and compensation for survivors and families outlasted both commissions and continued in parliamentary debate for years. Melbourne was also involved in a second collision with another destroyer, USS Frank E. Evans, in 1969, which killed 74 American sailors, an occurrence so improbable that the carrier's own crew eventually developed a darkly practical joke about her record that has passed into Australian naval folklore. The Evans collision and the Voyager disaster together gave HMS Melbourne the distinction of being the only aircraft carrier in history to have sunk two friendly destroyers in separate peacetime accidents. If you enjoyed this video, subscribe for similar ones and feel free to drop suggestions for the next video in the comments below.